Welcome back. Today we're going to dive deeper into evolution. So we've talked about Darwin a lot, but we're going to talk about some of the other things that we haven't addressed, and hopefully some of the things are a review. So Darwin's ideas had deep historical roots, and he had his own understanding of how the world worked and the history of the world. But as he kind of continued on his journeys, he saw that maybe people don't have it right, and maybe he doesn't have it right from what he was taught when he was younger. So um, we see that over time ideas started to change, and he really started to go against what was originally believed. So while he didn't um, while he was confident in what he was seeing, he didn't publish his findings initially. Remember, it took for Alfred Russel Wallace to um, really push him um, to publish his findings, because previous to that he was kind of afraid that he would ruin his career by doing so. Remember, this is back in the 1800s when they probably would have laughed at him and scoffed at him and said that he was um, sacrilegious, going against religion and really Catholicism. So um, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, he viewed species as kind of fixed and arranged them on the scala naturae, and he said that he kind of agreed with what everyone agreed for thousands of years, that the Old Testament um, says what is true, and the Old Testament says that, hey, God created all these species 6,000 years ago, and when he created the species, he made them perfectly. Now, if we go back and look at the Bible, it's kind of an interesting story to look at, interesting, and I personally believe in God, but when you start reading the Old Testament, which I know many people haven't necessarily read because of the emphasis on the New Testament in Christianity and Catholicism, but the Old Testament has a funny beginning, because it starts off where God created the heavens and the earth, and he on the seventh day he said let there be light, and then on the seventh day he rested, and everything goes from there. But you see, right in the beginning, one of the early pages, God, he, she, however you want to think of it, God says that everything is messed up, and I'm starting from scratch, and I'm wiping everyone out. So that right there is an interesting piece. So as much as the Bible says that he or God created everything perfectly, that little piece with the Noah's Ark is just kind of interesting to think about, how by the 10th page of the book, God's already thrown everything out and said, you know what, I got to restart. This is not how I wanted things to be, and humans aren't the way that they should be, and I'm starting all over. But anyway, so the idea is, from there, everything was perfect, and God had all the organisms that he wanted. He had them perfectly, and there was no need to change anything, and nothing was really able to change. So you have this guy Carolus Linnaeus. He created the system of taxonomy, which we now think about as naming organisms. But he kind of was classifying organisms, and that's how we came up with this binomial nomenclature, or binomial two-word kind of way of naming organisms, where we use the genus and we use the species. So Homo sapiens, you have the genus, and you have the species. Obviously, there are all the components previous to that, but if we know that the genus and the species, then that is the most specific way of naming them. Obviously, they have the class and the group and the phylum and the kingdom, all that previous to them, but those can go without saying, as long as we know the genus and then we know the species as well. So remember, first word is always capitalized and it is always in italics. And the study of fossils helped to lay the groundwork for Darwin's ideas. Remember, he has this kind of idea, but he doesn't know how to support the idea. So fossils are remains or traces of organisms from the past, usually found in sedimentary rock. They have to be found in sedimentary rock. If you remember from earth science, if you took earth science in high school, remember that you have metamorphic rock, which is going to be created from a lot of heat and pressure, and then you are going to have your igneous rock, which is created, it's created from heat ultimately, and the heat and the pressure and all of these are not really conducive for creating fossils. So what you need is sedimentary rock, which is not as intense on the organic matter, so it is able to survive. And what the sedimentary rock does is it ultimately coats the organic matter, it coats the remains of the bones or the whatever is left, and by coating it, it makes kind of an impression of what was there. So as much as we like to think of fossils as old bones, it's really a kind of a coating of rock around what once was. The bones may be gone, the shells might be gone, but that rock remains, and that rock remains in that shape to show what was there before. So you really need sedimentary rock, and that's why we have trouble finding fossils, because you need to have, if you're looking for a certain type of fossil, you want it to be in a certain layer, which we call strata. And they need to be in that strata because different strata have different ages. So if I'm looking for something that's going to be 380 million years old, well, I can't just look at any strata or any layer. I have to look at the layers that are going to be 380 million years old. And apart from looking for in that strata, I need the strata to be sedimentary rock because I'm not going to find any fossils in igneous or metamorphic rock. And then apart from that, I need the rock to be somewhat exposed. If the rock is not exposed, well, how do I get to it? So yeah, there might be some really nice strata that's 100 feet below the ground, but it would take a lot of equipment and a lot of hard work in order to get down there to kind of just look around and see if I could find any fossils. So in order for paleontologists or archaeologists, anthropologists, for people to really look in the strata, well, we're not going to try to dig to the center of the earth to look at all the different sedimentary rocks and the different ages and everything like that. We're looking for this specific type of rock, this specific age of rock, okay, and we want it to be exposed in order to do so. So you see that the basic principle is that the further up you go, the newer the material is, and obviously there's faulting and there's upheaval that goes on as well, so that is going to influence it. But we can kind of date the different layers and come up with this idea that the further we go up, the closer we are to current times. And apart from doing that, what we see is that, you know what, Darwin was must have been right, because if the if if he was wrong and God really did make everything 6,000 years ago, and all the organisms were there at the same time and he made them perfect, we would see that no matter which layer we went to, we would see organisms that were just as complex as the next layer. But what we really see is that as you go up through the layers, they become more and more complex. So you start with simple down here, and then as you work your way up, they become more complex. So that goes along with this idea of evolution. And paleontology is the study of fossils, and it was largely developed by the scientist Georges Cuvier. And he was this French scientist that speculated that the boundaries between the different layers of the strata represent catastrophic events that happened on the Earth. So while he looked at fossils, he also had to know a lot about really earth science and what was going on with the different strata. Now you have James Hutton and Charles Lyell, which were geologists, so they were more kind of earth scientists, if you want to call them that. They perceived that changes in Earth's surface can result from slow, continuous action still operating today and at the same rate. So Hutton and Lyell, and Darwin mentions Lyell, how when he was on a journey, he read Lyell, and he said that he thought Lyell's ideas were very interesting because Lyell was pointing to the idea that, hey, Earth was not exactly the way that it always was. God didn't just make the Earth and it stayed that way this whole time, but Earth kind of was, and we didn't use this term, but Earth itself was evolving. So maybe he didn't say it was evolving, but he was saying that it changes itself. It goes through this transition where Earth changes. And by looking at these changes, we can see how the Earth has changed over time and how the organisms have changed over time. And this kind of influenced Darwin's thinking on evolution and made him think, hey, you know what? the Earth is changing, maybe organisms are changing as well. So you have this guy, French scientist or biologist, called them naturalists, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Well, Lamarck, he had this idea, maybe an early idea of evolution. And he said, yeah, you know what? Species evolve through the use and disuse of body parts. Okay, they do change through the use and disuse of body parts. Now, this is not what Darwin said at all. So Lamarck and Darwin kind of had separate ideas where Darwin said, you know, you're going to have things with traits, and traits are either going to be beneficial or they're not going to be beneficial, and you're going to have this descent with modification. Lamarck wasn't saying descent with modification. He was saying use and disuse. He was saying that, hey, if we took a giraffe, right? A giraffe is a great example of Lamarck's ideas. He said, you look at a giraffe, and what do you notice about a giraffe? Well, they have these extremely long necks. Well, what is so, you know, how is it that giraffes could have these very long necks? Well, Lamarck said, you know what? Over time, they must have stretched their necks. Okay, each generation stretched their neck a little bit more. They kind of started to use their traits, and they stretched their neck, and then over time, you know, the next generation stretched their neck a little bit more because they needed to stretch it. It was, they were forced to stretch their neck in order for them to survive in their environment. And you know, Darwin, he wasn't saying that at all. He wasn't saying that, hey, you can just suddenly say, hey, the environment's this way, I'm going to change. I need to change in order to survive. Darwin was saying something kind of the opposite. He was saying, you know what, you are going to have certain traits, and the traits are what the traits are. But over time, the environment is going to select which traits are going to stay and which traits are going to no longer be around. Nature is going to select, natural selection is going to occur, and you're going to see this descent with modification. So while Lamarck was talking about organisms changing, he wasn't on track with how it was occurring. So unsupported by any evidence, and we still can't support it because we've now supported Darwin's idea with descent with modification. So some doubt about the permanence of species preceded Darwin's ideas. And you have during his travels on the HMS Beagle, Darwin collected specimens of South American plants and animals, and he looked at fossils that resembled living species from the same region, and living species resembled other species from nearby regions. He experienced an earthquake in Chile, and he saw a uplift of rocks, this is where he kind of said, hey, you know what, this guy Lyle is onto something. If there's all these changes going on in the earth, then it can't be that God just made the earth and made all these organisms, everything stays the same, everything's perfect. There must be changes going on. So, by Lyell's Principles of Geology, the book that he read while he was on his journey, he thought that the Earth must have been more than 6,000 years old. And he started to look at geographic distribution of species, and he ultimately, you know, landed on the Galapagos Islands, which was off the coast of South America. And he hypothesized that species from South America had colonized the Galapagos Islands. Somehow, some of these species got to the Galapagos Island, and now that they were on the island separated from the old population, right? So you take a small cohort or a small group of these organisms, you put them on an island, and the island has a different environment, you're going to see that now they are going to evolve into having different traits. So, in reassessing his observations, Darwin perceived that you have these traits or these adaptations to the environment and the origin of new species as closely related processes. So, from studies made years after Darwin's voyage, biologists have concluded that this is what has happened to the Galapagos finches, or to any organism really on the Galapagos. So Darwin was right in this idea that, hey, you have this descent with modification. You look at things like finches. Well, we now know, and we've known this for quite some time, but now that we're able to do DNA analysis, we're able to further support what we previously knew, that all of these finches that are on the different islands of the Galapagos archipelago, all of them are from one single finch species that came from mainland South America. And over time, by being in these different on these different islands in these different environments, having these different restrictions, they ultimately evolved to be different species. So they started as one species, they became all these different species depending on what niche they had to fill, what environment they lived in, and what pressures were placed on them, and what competition they had to deal with. So Darwin wrote an essay on natural selection in 1844 and the mechanism of descent with modification, but he didn't introduce it publicly, as we've discussed previously, because he thought it might ruin his career, and he was still a rather young man, and he had many years ahead of him. So natural selection is a process in which individuals with favorable inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. Remember, it's all about reproduction. So in 1858, you have Alfred Russel Wallace. He kind of said, hey, I have this idea. And the idea was ultimately just like Darwin's original idea from the 1830s, 1840s. And now Darwin said, you know what, rather than this guy take this idea away from me and I won't get any credit for it. He quickly published his Origin of Species, and they say that he gave Alfred Russel Wallace some credit as well. But obviously, you know, just we're talking about Alfred Russell Wallace right now, but the common population, most people, they have never heard of him. They've heard of Charles Darwin. So Darwin explained three broad observations where there's a unity of life, there's diversity of life, and the way organisms are suited to live in their environment is going to really influence their evolution. So we like to draw, and Darwin even drew a early cladogram or phylogenetic tree or evolutionary tree that where you see very simply kind of drew out, hey, you know what, it looks like maybe things could have evolved in this way. And just a very simple drawing that came with this idea that, hey, there's a common ancestor, and then they become different species. And he actually drew that in his notebook, very kind of famous little sketch that he did. And now we see that now we use these phylogenetic trees that are much more complex. And in a true phylogenetic tree, the distance going this way represents the time. So you see that this happened at a specific time. It took a certain amount of years. And then also the distance between each node is also showing how related these organisms are to one another. So there is kind of a science to the way that phylogenetic trees are created. You don't need to necessarily know that science, but just understand that these are not just random drawings like Darwin did, but they are very specific and scientific. So Darwin noted that humans have modified other species by selecting and breeding individuals where it's not natural selection, but we like to call it artificial selection. And I always talk about a big example is pit bulls, right? People love their bully breeds, French bulldogs, American bulldog, pit bulls, anything like that. They breed them for certain traits, and dogs in general have been bred for certain traits. They come from wolves. All dogs come from wolves, but you see that over time we've created, you know, big Doberman Pinschers, Rottweilers, but we've also created little terriers and Chihuahuas and whatever other little dogs you can think of. So all these different dogs, they all came from wolves. Well, it wasn't from natural selection; it was from artificial selection. Us picking the traits over a long time. I wanted a smaller and smaller dog. I'm going to keep taking the smaller and smaller, and that's how you end up with these teacup breeds where the dog is smaller than my hand. But another example is this wild mustard plant. And wild mustard was really just a weed. And over time, different farmers selected for different traits within that wild mustard and ultimately created all these different vegetables that we think of as being completely different, but they all have a common ancestor, which is the wild mustard plant. And it created kale because you selected for the leaves. Brussels sprouts you selected for these little sprouts. Cabbage you selected for this head of cabbage. Broccoli, kohlrabi, all these things, by selecting for different traits, we've created different types of the plant. So Darwin drew two inferences and two observations. His first observation was that members of a population often vary in their inherited traits, so you have different inherited traits, and then all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and reproduce. So that's where you have more organisms being born than can survive, and the ones that are going to be able to survive are going to pass on their traits, and the other ones that don't have the good traits, don't have the good genes, are not going to pass that on. And inference one is that individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals, obviously. And inference two, this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits, right? The adaptations that help you to survive in the population over generations is going to help them to accumulate. So individuals with certain heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Natural selection increases the frequency of adaptations that are favorable in a given environment. If an environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation these new conditions, and that is going to lead to new species. So note that individuals do not evolve, right? We never say that individuals are evolving. If one individual has a mutation and it makes them very different, well, we don't say, oh, evolution has occurred. It's not till we see that it is a beneficial trait and it has moved into a significant amount of the population that we say that population really has evolved. So individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. And natural selection can only increase or decrease heritable traits that vary in a population. So if it's a trait that's acquired, we've talked about epigenetics and how the environment is influencing the epigenome. Okay, but if it's something like cancer, well, cancer is not going to be inherited unless it is involved with a specific gene. So, if you get a sunburn and you burn your skin, or you get a scar, well, that scar isn't going to be inherited because it has to do with your genes or something that happened from the environment. So adaptations vary with different environments. And you see that evolution is supported by an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. Now, this is where we talk about what's the difference between a fact or a law and a theory. Now, really, the idea is that in science, we would love to say that things are always a fact, always a law. And you see in physics, chemistry, they talk about laws a lot because they're able to say that, hey, this is how things happen. But in biology, we have law or ideas that we can't necessarily back up with something that is going to be talking about how things were in the past. Well, I can't make it a law. I can't say that it's an absolute 100% fact because I can't go back in time and show you that. So it's something like evolution. It has to be a theory. I can support it with all the evidence possible, but I can't say it's 100% fact. I can't make it a law because I can't go back in time and show it to you. So with all this evidence, I am going to make a theory. And theory in science is not a bad thing. It doesn't mean, oh, it's I think, but it might not be. It's just an idea I came up with. Theory means, hey, I can't say it's a law, but I'm pretty darn sure with all the evidence that I have that this is what occurred. So we have all this evidence to support it. And the four types of data documented, we have direct observations, homologous structures we look at, fossil record, and then biogeography as well. So two examples provide evidence of natural selection in response to introduced species and the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. So when we introduce species, we see that they are going to change in their changing environment. And we also see evolution in bacteria. When we introduce antibiotics to them, then they are forced to, or the antibiotics ultimately weeds out the ones that don't have any resistance to the antibiotics, and all that's left are the ones that are, and over time they evolve to all the organisms are going to have that resistance to that bacteria, and that's why we run into this issue. So the biggest example that we like to talk about is this MRSA, which is methicillin resistant Staph aureus, and we have Staphylococcus aureus, which is a type of bacteria. We have that all over our skin all the time. You ever hear about, hey, I have a staph infection? Well, staph infection doesn't really mean too much of anything. It really means that, maybe you have a weakened immune system, or you were getting sick, and or you had an open cut or something like that, and it got infected with the bacteria that's always around. So staph is not necessarily a bad thing, but now we see that with the use of using all these different antibiotics, we're constantly killing off the Staphylococcus aureus, or the Staph aureus that is always around. and we ultimately made the Staph aureus be stronger and resistant to the antibiotics we have. So now it has become very dangerous. MRSA, which is the specific type of Staph aureus that we deal with now because it is resistant to all our antibiotics that we have. Well, now that's a problem because when someone has MRSA, it's hard for us to get rid of it. So resistant to penicillin, resistance to penicillin evolved in Staph aureus by 1945, and 2 years after it was first widely used. So that happened kind of quickly. And then you see resistance to methicillin, which was a better antibiotic, evolved by 1961, which was 2 years after that was uh, widely used. So you see that bacteria are able to evolve very quickly as we find ways to combat them. So it works by inhibiting an enzyme used by bacteria to produce cell walls. So it's really breaking down the enzyme that helps create the cell wall. So it breaks down the cell wall. And the MRSA bacteria use a different enzyme in cell wall production. So it's kind of made its way around our way of killing it. So when exposed to methicillin, MRSA strains are more likely to survive and reproduce than non-resistant Staph aureus strains. So MRSA strains are now resistant to almost all of our antibiotics. So natural selection does not create new traits, but it edits or selects the traits already present in the population. So somewhere along the way, one of the bacteria either had a mutation or it had a trait that was different, and that's what made it survive. And it wiped out all the ones that didn't have that. And maybe there was only a few that did have that trait, but those few were able to prosper and survive and pass on those traits. And then before you know it, all the other ones continue to get wiped out, and the ones that do have the trait are thriving and surviving and passing on those traits. And all you're left with are those strong antibiotic resistant um, uh, um, MRSA bacteria. So evolution by natural selection can occur rapidly in species with short generation times like bacteria, and the current local environment determines which traits will be selected for or selected against in any specific population. So once again, even though we're changing the environment, it is all about the environment that is putting the pressures on the genes. So we also look at homologous structures or homology, where we see that different organisms, they might have different traits, but they have resemblances to each other. So one thing is that you see in many organisms, we all have this basic design of you have in an arm or a wing or in a excuse me, a fin or a forelimb. You're going to have big bone, which we call humerus, two smaller bones, still big bones, bunch of tiny little bones look like pebbles, and then you're going to have 5 of these and 5 of these. So in humans, we have a humerus, a radius, and an ulna. You have your carpal, your wrist bones, and then you have rods for metacarpals and rods for phalanges. Well, you see that the same here. Look, one big, two smaller, bunch of tiny ones, 5 and 5. 1, 2, bunch of them, 5, 5. Okay, maybe not with this so much, but with the bat, you see it, bat wing, cat, slim, humans, but you see this basic idea of 1, 2, a bunch, and then you have these rods for metacarpals and phalanges. So comparative embryology is another way that we look at them, and you see that when you look at organisms in the embryologic state, when there are embryos, right before they become a fetus, they look very similar. If you look at a chick embryo and a human embryo, they look very similar. They both have these phalangeal arches, sometimes you call them gill arches, and they have a post-anal tail. We also have vestigial structures that we see. So if you look, humans have like a tailbone. So a tailbone, we don't have tails anymore, but it's from our ancestral species that had tails once upon a time. And we look at these evolutionary trees or our phylogenetic trees, which are diagrams that show how things have changed over time. And we like to build them based on not only anatomical or morphological features, but now we can look at DNA sequences as well. And that can help us to create these phylogenetic trees where we see that, hey, we have a common ancestor here that branched off to become lungfishes, and then other organisms, and those other organisms eventually, this common ancestor became amphibians and everything else, and then this one became mammals and everything else, and this one became branched off into lizards and then went to become birds and crocodiles and so on and so forth. You have convergent evolution though, which is kind of weird, where things might seem to be related, but it's because they were in similar environments and it was important for them to have similar traits. So they evolved to end up having similar traits, even though they are not related to each other. You see something like a sugar glider and a flying squirrel, not related, but they ended up with similar traits because it was beneficial for them to have those specific traits. Then we look at the fossil record as well, which is going to help us to look at the idea that as we go through the strata, the lower strata have simple organisms, and as we go through time, we can see that they become more complex, and we can also look at the different anatomical features and how they changed over time. Biogeography is actually this study of the geographic distribution of species, and it provides evidence of evolution as well, where we can look at how the geography used to be compared to one another, one land to another land. How has it changed over time? Remember, Pangea is this idea that all of the continents were once united. So you might see that, hey, these things might have been, these two pieces of land might have been close to together at one point, and that's why these two species, they might have been separated, but they are closely related. And then you have endemic species, which are only found in specific areas. And if you have an endemic species, you can look at that and see how it has changed over time. Islands have many endemic species that are often closely related to species on the nearest mainland, where it's not the same species, but they are closely related to them. And Darwin suggests that species from the mainland colonized islands and gave rise to new species as they adapted to the new environments. That's what you talked about with Galapagos tortoises, Galapagos finches. That's the whole idea behind his descent with modification, natural selection, and evolution in the Galapagos Islands. So what is theoretical about Darwin's view of life? Well, in science, you have the theory accounts for many observations and data and attempts to explain and integrate a great variety of phenomena. And the theory of evolution by natural selection integrates diverse areas of biology and stimulates many new research questions, and ongoing research adds to our understanding of evolution. So there's a lot of different scenarios that the theory can be a part of, and we continue to research this, but once again, we can't say that it's 100% because there are so many different things that it applies to, and when we and we can't really go back in time and see things evolve. We can look at microevolution, which we've looked at before, but macroevolution, we can't go back in time. We don't have a time machine and look at it over time. We just don't live long enough, and we can't go back in time, like I said. So the fossil record reveals changes in the history of life on Earth. Like I said, sedimentary rocks, looking at fossils, that is going to help us to support our theory of evolution. So the order of fossils in rock strata tells us the order in which they were formed, and we can infer relative ages of fossils using this method, but not their actual ages. But in order to come up with actual age, we like to use radiometric dating or using radioisotopes. And using this radiometric dating by knowing the half-life of a specific substance and how long it takes for it to radioactively decay, we can come up with how long that fossil has been there. So if we look at, hey, it takes a certain amount of time for it to decay halfway, we know how long it's been, depending on, is it halfway decayed, is it has it decayed halfway twice, meaning there's only a quarter of it left, of the original isotope left. What about an eighth, a 16th? So by looking at this, we can know. So if we know how long it's been, say, when we look at carbon-14, it takes about 5,700 years for it to decay. Well, it took 5,700 years for it to get to halfway, then another 5,700 years to get to here. So now we start looking at this difference, okay, and we can keep going on to, up to, tens of thousands of years. And then with that's with carbon-14. There are other radioactive isotopes that can get us even further. So while carbon-14 and looking at how it is going to decay into carbon-12, that can only take us to about 75,000 years old. But there are other radioisotopes that have longer half-lives, longer than that 5,700 years, longer ones that can take us much further, because if you have one that, say, just for an example, is 30,000 years for it to decay, well, then I can look at two cycles, or a quarter of it being left, and now that's going to bring you to 60,000 years just then, and then you can go to an eighth of it left, 16th of it left, and you're going from there. So mammals belong to a group of animals called tetrapods, and this is where we're going to kind of finish up, and we'll pick up on this next time. So the evolution of unique mammalian features can be traced in the fossil record. And we like to often look at things that are called transitional species. And transitional species are kind of, we like to say that they've made a breakthrough in evolution, all right, or major change. Okay, so one example that we like to talk about is tiktaalik. And this is kind of the fish that started to walk on land. All right, another example would be Australopithecus afarensis. This is the organism that left the jungle and really started to walk on 2 feet, which we call bipedalism or bipedalism. And then you also have ones like Homo erectus. And Homo erectus is started to stand upright. So these are major changes that occurred, and there are numerous other transitional species, but these are the ones that we often like to talk about. So you have ones that evolve to uh, create these tetrapods, walking on 4 limbs, and the evolution of unique mammalian features can be traced in the fossil record. So we can see where organisms started to become more mammalian by looking at, say, the jaws and the teeth of organisms, how we got away from being reptilian and became more mammalian over time.